Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a grand marble courtyard in Imperial Rome. It's dusk and torches bloom to life, throwing hungry orange light across the white stone. Golden banners flutter, servants rush by with silver trays, and the emperor himself is about to emerge. But tonight, everyone's eyes are fixed not on Nero, but on the figure beside him. A breathtaking young woman in flowing purple silk, her hair coiffed with pearls, a slender diadem resting delicately upon her brow. Her steps are graceful, measured, her gaze cast down just as any proper empress might lower her eyes. Except she is not a woman, and everyone here knows it. Whispers slither like snakes across the marble floors. That was a boy, was it not? The same freed slave who ran errands in the palace courtyard? What have they done to him? And so the crowd watches with morbid fascination, unable to look away. They see how Nero's hand tightens possessively around this young creature's waist. They see the hollow, practiced smile on lips that were never meant to be painted crimson. They see a ghost brought back from the grave, not by divine mercy but by imperial obsession. Because this is not merely a scandal. This is a masterpiece of horror, orchestrated by a man who wielded absolute power over 60 million souls, and who found that not even death could separate him from the thing he loved. Nero did more than castrate a boy. He stripped away an entire identity, carved grief into flesh, and forced the living to imitate the dead. In Rome, where cruelty was often draped in silk and crowned with laurel, this story was still enough to make hardened senators shudder behind jeweled goblets. Tonight, we walk through this nightmare together, not to stare at freakish decadence from a safe distance, but to understand how a single man's grief and vanity could spiral into a tragedy so profound it still echoes 2,000 years later. Because in the flickering torchlight of this courtyard, as Nero smiles and pulls his living doll closer, we are forced to confront a truth darker than any myth. That love twisted by absolute power does not become devotion. It becomes tyranny wearing a lover's mask. To understand how such a grotesque spectacle could unfold, you must first understand the world that made it possible. Rome in the mid-1st century AD, a civilization swollen with wealth, drunk on conquest, ruled by a boy who never learned where grief ends and possession begins. Nero was 17 when he became emperor, crowned amid lavish promises of a golden age. At first, he seemed almost gentle compared to the iron-fisted tyrants before him. He reduced taxes, poured money into games and theatres, and wandered the streets in disguise to mingle with commoners who found him oddly charming. But power does strange things to men, especially when that power is absolute and inherited without earning. And when draped in purple and surrounded by courtiers who praised every indulgence, even small cracks of cruelty could widen into gaping maws. At the centre of Nero's world was a woman named Poppaea Sabina. She was his mistress first, then his empress. A woman of astonishing beauty, sharp wit, and ruthless ambition. The love he bore for her seemed, at least from a distance, to be the stuff of tragic epics, overwhelming, consuming, poetic. Ancient historians said he couldn't bear to have her out of sight. He showered her with jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia, spending so freely the treasury itself began to strain. But even Rome's vast coffers were not as fragile as Nero's own heart. Poppaea knew her power came from her beauty, and how thoroughly it enchanted the emperor. And while she manoeuvred carefully at court, securing favours for her family, whispering alliances into being, she never seemed to fear the thin line between his adoration and his violence, until the day she misjudged it. In the summer of 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant again, carrying what might finally have been Nero's long-hoped-for heir. Perhaps that's why she dared to scold him about his endless games, his racing chariots through city streets while ignoring affairs of state. Perhaps it was simply the inevitable friction of a marriage between two predators who knew each other too well. What happened next was recounted with sickened fascination by every Roman historian who lived to write it down. In a fit of white-hot rage, Nero lashed out. Some accounts say he kicked her in the belly, others describe a blow from his fist that knocked her against the marble. Either way, it was fatal. Within hours, Poppaea was dead, along with the unborn child that might have secured Rome's future. The emperor who ruled the known world collapsed beside her body, sobbing and screaming for her to return. He refused the traditional Roman funeral pyre, insisting her corpse be embalmed with the most costly spices and locked away in a lavish mausoleum. Then, as if trying to reverse death itself through sheer denial, he decreed her divine, a goddess who would be worshipped alongside Venus and Juno. But grief twisted inside Nero, turning rotten. His palace became a theatre of obsession. He ordered statues of Poppaea to be raised in every garden, paintings of her to hang in every hall. Banquets were served beneath ceilings painted with her likeness, and any courtier who failed to speak of her in the present tense risked exile or worse. And then came the day Nero spotted Sporus. Sporus was a youth of about 14, slight of build, with eyes large and luminous enough to stir rumours that he was the very image of the dead empress as a child. He was the son of slaves or minor freedmen, no one remembers precisely, and had grown up in the imperial household. That he could read, write, and perform small administrative tasks meant he'd been trained for useful service, perhaps destined for some minor palace office. He could not have imagined what it meant when Nero summoned him, because for all Rome's decadent pageantry, its brutal entertainments in the Colosseum, its gladiators and public crucifixions, nothing prepared even the jaded aristocrats of the court for what their emperor planned next. Nero did not merely take Sporus into his household as a favoured page. He did not simply dress him in Poppeia's robes and jewels to satisfy a grotesque fantasy. He decided to make the illusion complete, permanent. He ordered Rome's finest surgeons to do what nature had not. They performed a castration that was far more than the typical Greek-style youth eunuchry. It was an attempt to craft a living replacement. Under crude anaesthetics, using tools meant for butchery rather than healing, they mutilated Sporus, trying to carve him into a shape that would better match Nero's memories of his dead wife. It was a ritual as old as power itself. Destroy the individual so thoroughly that they can no longer resist becoming what you desire. When Sporus awoke, his body forever changed. The echo of Poppaea that Nero sought had taken gruesome physical form. From that moment on, he would live in the shadow of a woman who no longer existed, his own identity erased to comfort the madness of an emperor who believed his will could even conquer death. And the court applauded. They feasted, they toasted, they praised Nero's devotion, because Rome itself was a stage, and survival often meant knowing your lines. What followed was less a marriage than a carefully orchestrated haunting. Nero did not simply keep Sporus close, he staged a complete resurrection. The boy was dressed daily by hand-picked attendants in gowns woven from Tyrian purple, the colour reserved for emperors and gods. Imperial goldsmiths refashioned Poppeia's jewellery to fit Sporus's narrower wrists and throat. Nero even ordered hairdressers to style Sporus's dark curls into the same towering coils once worn by his dead wife. Each morning, the ritual began anew. Cosmetics to soften the sharp lines of youth into something more womanly, charcoal to widen the eyes, vermilion mixed with crushed pearls to lend an artificial glow. But perhaps most disturbing were the lessons. Sporus was coached relentlessly by matronly courtiers who had once served Poppaea. They trained him in how to lower his eyes in demure modesty, how to walk with delicate measured steps across slick marble, how to tilt his head when receiving guests so that earrings would catch the light. He was taught to adjust his voice to something lighter, breathier, almost girlish. This was not education. It was transformation. Body and soul. And throughout it all Nero watched. Sometimes he sat silently in a gilded chair, dark eyes never blinking, as Sporus rehearsed greetings or practiced accepting offerings of wine from trembling slaves. Sometimes he interrupted, correcting the boy with eerie tenderness, placing a hand on his back to straighten his posture, guiding a pale hand into a more graceful curve. Other times his mood swung violently. He would seize Sporus by the chin, searching his face for the ghost of Poppaea, and if he found it wanting, his own features would twist into rage. Yet the performances continued. Day after day, month after month, the palace became a theatre devoted to a single illusion, that Poppaea had returned in the fragile form of a mutilated boy. The culmination of this twisted obsession came in the spring of 67 AD, when Nero announced he would marry Sporus in a ceremony mirroring the grand rites once used to unite patrician houses. Invitations went out across Rome's elite, hand-lettered on scrolls bearing imperial seals. Priests were summoned from the temples of Venus and Juno to bless what even they could hardly name. On the appointed day, crowds gathered outside the palace, drawn by rumour and morbid curiosity. Inside, torchlight made the marble columns seem like the trunks of an ancient spectral forest. Incense thickened the air until breathing felt almost sacramental. Sporus entered on a litter draped in white gauze, carried by 6 eunuchs whose blank expressions betrayed years of practiced silence. The boy wore a veil that trailed behind him for yards, studded with sapphires meant to symbolize fidelity, though to whom or what no one could rightly say. When the veil was lifted, a collective shudder rippled through the assembly. Sporus's face was transformed by paint and artifice, but it was the look in his eyes that chilled the blood, wide, luminous, and hollow. He looked neither boy nor woman, neither alive nor truly dead, a living monument to the emperor's grief and power. Nero took his hand. Together they approached the altar, surrounded by senators, generals, and poets, who pretended this was nothing more than an imperial wedding. Vows were spoken, rings exchanged. A priest offered a solemn chant to Venus, the goddess of love, who must have turned her eyes away in pity or disgust. Then came the kiss. Nero pressed his lips against Sporus's mouth with desperate fervour, as if trying to breathe Poppaea back into existence. The hall erupted in carefully measured applause, and slaves scattered rose petals across the floor to mask the stench of sweat and fear. That night, a banquet stretched until dawn. Sporus was placed on a gilded couch beside Nero, required to laugh at his jokes, to murmur gentle rebukes if he drank too heavily, to press cool hands to his fevered temples when his mind turned dark. Guests brought costly gifts, embroidered tunics, carved ivory boxes, delicately chased mirrors, each one an unspoken bribe to remain in the emperor's favour by accepting his monstrous fantasy. But under it all was silence, a silence that clung to the walls of the palace, to the throats of courtiers, to the hollow chest of a boy who no longer recognised the sound of his own name. From the day of that grotesque wedding forward, Sporus ceased to exist as anything resembling himself. What Nero had engineered was not merely a marriage, but the deliberate dismantling of a human being. Every waking moment in the palace was governed by one purpose: to erase the boy he had been, and to sculpt, with surgical precision, the perfect echo of Poppaea. It began with the simplest things. His birth name, once whispered by tutors and friends in childhood, was banished from the imperial tongue. Servants addressed him only as Sabina, Poppaea's formal name. Even guards posted at his door were instructed to bow low and murmur "Ave, Augusta," as though greeting a living empress. His chambers were refitted to resemble Poppaea's old apartments exactly. Nero ordered craftsmen to reproduce every painted panel, every mosaic tile, every delicate silver urn that had once held Poppaea's perfumes. The bed was the same, wide enough for imperial theatrics, draped in purple, smelling faintly of lavender and decay. When Sporus lay there at night, eyes wide open in the dark, he felt as though he was lying inside her tomb. And the performances never ceased. Each morning, ladies-in-waiting bustled in to dress him. They fussed over his hair, wove fresh flowers into the dark curls, adjusted strings of pearls that made his pale throat gleam like milk. Then came the cosmetics, a laborious hour of dusting, blotting, staining, until the face that stared back from polished bronze looked nothing like a Roman youth. It was a face crafted to seduce, to console, to remind Nero of everything he had lost and everything he had forced back into being. Voice coaches continued their lessons. Sporus was made to recite old love poems in the lilting cadence of a woman. If his voice cracked or dipped too low, he was punished. Sometimes a slap, sometimes simply an hour of being ignored by everyone in the room as if he'd vanished entirely. That silence, that sudden negation, cut deeper than any blow. It was in small humiliations that the Empire's cruelty showed its sharpest edge. At banquets, Sporus had to sit on Nero's left, the place of honour reserved for a wife. He was required to smile, to sip delicately from golden cups, to blush at bawdy jokes made by leering senators. When guests toasted the divine Augusta, all eyes turned to him, and he was expected to bow his head gracefully, feigning modesty that hid a raw, gnawing emptiness. But beyond the rituals of court lay darker degradations. Nero delighted in staging private tableaux that pushed Sporus's role beyond the limits of sanity. He commanded his bride to dance in silk veils before small gatherings of Rome's most jaded elites, to reenact scenes from myth, Leda and the Swan, Europa and the Bull, casting Sporus in the role of the ravished maiden. Nobles would watch, half drunk, eyes glittering with amusement or pity or lust, while Sporus moved like a puppet in a gruesome theatre. And always Nero sat closest, reclining on his couch with heavy lids half-shuttered, one hand toying idly with a dagger or a fig. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he wept. Most often he simply watched, mouth curling at the edges, as if savouring a private triumph. The psychological destruction was systematic. By forcing Sporus to perform these humiliations daily, Nero taught him that his suffering was not merely expected but celebrated. Every smile from a senator, every polite clap of patrician hands reinforced the same lesson. This was Rome's new normal, a young boy's spirit contorted to amuse an emperor's grief. Behind the scenes, slaves whispered that Sporus sometimes fled to secluded corners of the palace to vomit after these performances, that he clawed at his own skin, trying to scrub off layers of paint and powder until his cheeks bled, that he prayed to gods who no longer listened, if they ever had. Yet even private desperation offered no refuge. Nero kept him under constant surveillance. Spies, eunuchs, and eunuch servants reported every sigh, every flicker of rebellion. They delivered nightly accounts to Nero, who might appear the next morning at Sporus's bedside, tender as a lover, cooing about dreams they surely must have shared. Dreams where Poppaea returned, whole and smiling, draped in veils that smelled of crushed violets. By degrees, Sporus's original identity eroded under the relentless weight of Nero's obsession. He forgot the rough Latin dialect of his childhood house. He lost the easy swagger of a Roman boy, the careless laughter, the hopes of someday owning land, marrying, fathering children. Those pieces of him died quietly, without funeral or monument. And through it all, Rome applauded, because Nero's power did not rest merely on legions or gold. It depended on spectacle, on forcing the entire empire to witness his madness and agree by their silence or strained smiles that it was not madness at all. The senators who praised Sporus's delicate hands, the matrons who gifted him fine oils, the poets who composed trembling odes to his eyes, they all became accomplices in the emperor's crime. This was the genius of Nero's cruelty. By transforming Sporus into Poppaea's ghost, he proved to Rome that he could bend reality itself, that under his rule, the difference between man and woman, truth and lie, sanity and insanity, was nothing more than a whim to be reshaped at imperial pleasure. And Sporus, mutilated and repainted each day, was the living testament to that terrible truth. The horror reached its grotesque zenith not behind closed doors, but under Rome's burning sun, where spectacle and cruelty merged so seamlessly they became indistinguishable. Nero, ever hungry for new ways to astonish and scandalize, decided to unveil his masterpiece before the masses. He would not simply keep Sporus as his private shadow of Poppaea. No, he would parade this living effigy through Rome itself, turning the city into a stage and its people into an audience complicit in his madness. The occasion was the Floralia, a riotous spring festival known for its bawdy entertainments, erotic plays, and bright showers of flower petals thrown from balconies. Nero announced that he and his empress would make a public procession to celebrate Rome's prosperity and his own undying love. The Senate was commanded to attend. Foreign envoys who gossiped in dozens of curious dialects gathered with thinly veiled intrigue. Commoners packed every step, every rooftop, eager for blood or laughter, it hardly mattered which. On that blazing afternoon, Sporus was arrayed more splendidly than any real Roman bride. Draped in gold-dusted veils so fine they clung like mist to his thin shoulders, crowned with a wreath of myrtle and roses, he sat atop a high chariot pulled by white horses festooned with garlands. Painted boys ran ahead scattering petals. Flutists played lilting, decadent airs that once accompanied sacred rites of Venus. Beside him stood Nero, laurelled and robed in imperial purple, waving casually as if this grotesque pageant were the most natural sight in the empire. They moved slowly through the streets, the spectacle designed to draw out every gasp, every double-take. Some citizens laughed behind their hands, others went rigid with horror. Many simply stared, unable to look away from the haunting figure on the chariot. A boy with haunted eyes, a painted mouth trembling in a half-forgotten smile, whose fragile wrists bore the weight of centuries' expectations. When they reached the Circus Maximus, the heart of Roman public life, Nero took it further still. He led Sporus by the hand down marble steps to a platform raised above the chariot lanes. There, with the entire city as witness, he performed a mock ritual of devotion, bowing before Sporus, kissing the boy's feet, calling him Augusta, in a voice that cracked with something halfway between hysteria and triumph. The crowd was stunned into silence. It was one thing to whisper about the emperor's private perversities, quite another to see them played out as theatre, sanctioned by every senator, general and magistrate forced to attend. But the day's cruelty was not yet complete. As evening fell and torches were lit by the hundreds, Nero commanded a reenactment of a sacred marriage rite, the Confariatio, traditionally reserved for the noblest unions of Rome's most ancient families. Priests of Jupiter stood trembling as they invoked blessings that felt blasphemous on their own tongues. They pressed spelt cakes into Sporus's hands. They sprinkled his head with salt and grains, intoning solemn words that had once bound patrician brides to their husbands in eternity. Sporus stood utterly still, his thin chest rising and falling under layers of embroidered silk, eyes glazed with a sickly sheen. When Nero slid a ring onto his finger and proclaimed him Poppaea reborn, a faint shiver ran through the boy's shoulders. The only sign of the soul trapped somewhere inside. Trumpets blared. Slaves scattered rose petals that stuck in Sporus's sweat-damp hair. The crowd, at last freed from their shocked paralysis, erupted in a roar that was neither quite applause nor outright condemnation, just the raw animal noise of thousands confronting something too monstrous to process cleanly. And so Nero's ultimate theatre succeeded. The Roman populace, by its sheer overwhelmed presence, became a chorus to his delusion. They had witnessed the obliteration of a human boy, the enthronement of a ghost, and through their stunned complicity, they helped cement the lie into the city's stone arteries. When the festivities ended, Sporus was led away on trembling legs, trailed by attendants who gathered his veil and steadied his arm as if he were a fragile saint. In truth, he was less than a saint, less even than a slave. He was a living offering, sacrificed daily on the altar of Nero's grief and grotesque love. Back in the palace that night, the torches burned low and silence fell heavy over the marble halls. Nero lay beside Sporus on a bed still strewn with stray petals, whispering endearments meant for a woman long rotted to dust. He called Sporus by Poppaea's pet names, recounted shared memories the boy had never lived, wept tears that soaked the painted cheek pressed reluctantly against his shoulder. Outside, Rome slept uneasily. Inside, the final act of the night's performance continued behind gilded doors. A private tragedy no less horrifying than the public one, sealing forever the ruin of a child whose only crime had been to resemble a dead empress. By the second year of this grotesque charade, something inside Sporus had begun to quietly die. It was not the death of the body, not yet, but of whatever small, bright spark had once lit his boyhood days, that reckless laugh that might have startled birds from the olive trees in a distant country villa he barely remembered. Now that spirit was dim, guttering like a candle starved of air, Rome's nobles remarked on how gracefully the empress carried himself, how calm and soft-spoken he had grown. They did not see that this poise was a hollow architecture, built around a void where his own thoughts no longer dared to linger. In the silent hours, when Nero's breathing turned to a drunken snore, Sporus would stare up at carved ceilings painted with gods, and wonder if they mocked him, those divine faces beaming down at a creature who was neither man nor woman, neither servant nor sovereign, but a living effigy of grief. And still Nero clung to him. If anything, the emperor's obsession had only sharpened into desperation as conspiracies sprouted across the empire. Rebellions flickered to life in distant provinces. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's final shield, began to murmur of alternatives to a madman on the throne. Nero could feel power slipping through his jewelled fingers. In that unravelling, he tightened his hold on Sporus, as if by clutching this boy-turned-doll, he might halt the decay of everything else. Then suddenly it was over. In 68 AD, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The streets of Rome, once thick with crowds shouting his name, now rang with the measured tramp of hostile soldiers. The emperor fled with only a handful of loyalists, Sporus among them, bundled in hurriedly packed silks, clutching a tiny casket of Poppaea's old trinkets, pressed upon him by Nero at the last moment, as if they might be talismans strong enough to ward off fate. They took refuge in a villa outside the city, walls still hung with mosaics of laughing nymphs that made their doom seem crueler by contrast. Here, reality collapsed in earnest. Nero raved by turns, cursing Rome, then weeping over its betrayal, then fondling Sporus's face with trembling hands as if to memorize every fragile line. "Don't leave me," he whispered. "Promise me you'll never leave. You are all that's left." The words fell like dust. Sporus simply nodded, eyes dull, as if already looking at something far beyond the gilded walls. When soldiers finally arrived at the gates, Nero ordered a servant to strike the fatal blow he could not muster himself. Blood soaked the mosaic floor, darkening the ivory skin of his throat. Sporus knelt beside him, lips parted as though he might scream, but no sound emerged. He touched the emperor's slack hand, then let it drop. He did not weep. In that moment, Sporus was not freed. The chains that bound him to Nero's fantasies would long outlive the man himself. Roman generals saw at once the political value of this eerie relic, this breathing reminder of imperial debauchery. He was seized and carried back to the city, not as a person but a trophy. It was in the reign of Vitellius that the final cruelty came. Seeking to humiliate Nero's memory, Vitellius proposed a public farce in the arena. Sporus, dressed again in bridal garments, would be violated before thousands in a brutal parody of the imperial wedding, a last spectacle to gorge Rome's appetite for scandal. Faced with this horror, Sporus made his only true choice. Before dawn could light the stones of the city, he slipped from his guards and drank a draught of poison. The sun rose on a quiet courtyard where servants later found his body, lips stained, hands folded on his breast as if in prayer to gods who had never cared for him. Thus ended the life of the boy forced to become an empress. In death he found what Nero had denied him in life, a moment governed by his own will, a final silence unsullied by laughter or command. But even in death, Sporus was not spared humiliation. His lifeless form became an object of dark fascination for Rome, the ultimate relic of Nero's reign, a twisted symbol on which new rulers could stamp their authority. Vitellius, thwarted in his plans for a living spectacle, still found a way to use Sporus's memory to amuse and horrify. Whispers spread through the marble halls and crowded forums. Courtiers exchanged lurid tales of the boy who had once sat crowned in myrtle, hands trembling as priests pronounced him Augusta. Merchants carved crude likenesses into lamp handles, selling them as morbid curiosities to visiting provincials who longed for a taste of the capital's notorious decadence. In taverns, drunken men mimicked the fragile sway of Sporus's ceremonial walk, laughing as they minced across dirt floors, wreaths of cheap laurel drooping over sweat-slick hair. At grand banquets, jesters donned bridal veils and powdered their faces white, staggering about on borrowed sandals while nobles howled with delight, mocking not just Nero's madness, but the boy who had borne it, whose slender shoulders had once balanced an empire's most obscene fantasy. Through this grotesque mirth, Sporus was finally reduced to what Rome had always intended him to be. An empty entertainment, stripped of will, of voice, of dignity. A shadow puppet danced across the walls of imperial memory. No one laid flowers at his resting place. No marble epitaph recorded his real name. He remained only a scandal to be recounted over wine, a cautionary jest that masked the deeper horror of what power could do when it chose to remake a human soul for its own grotesque amusement. And so the tale of Sporus dissolved into Rome's swirling currents of rumour and ridicule, leaving behind no monument but the dark echo of his suffering. The senators who once bowed to Nero's will now raised toasts over stories of the boy bride, savouring the scandal while absolving themselves of any complicity. Playwrights wove mocking tragedies that paraded Sporus's ghost across their stages, draped once more in a murdered woman's jewels, weeping prettily for laughs. Yet beneath these performances festered a deeper rot, one that no jest could cleanse. For Sporus's fate was not an aberration of Rome. It was its mirror, an empire that exalted marble ideals of reason and virtue, that wrote treatises on stoic mastery of the self, still found its cruelest delight in reshaping living bodies to sate private appetites. It found theatre in the obliteration of a boy's identity, found politics in parading his ruin through candlelit halls. Even now, across millennia, his story refuses to lie still. It seeps through the cracks of history's grand facades to remind us that absolute power does not merely corrupt. It consumes, distorts, recreates. It turns grief into pageantry, turns human beings into props for others' consolations and excesses. Perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson Sporus leaves us, that under the weight of adoration or tyranny alike, a person can be remade so thoroughly that even their own reflection becomes unrecognizable, until death becomes the only claim left on their own existence. And if we dare to look honestly, we might find echoes of his tragedy even now, hidden behind modern rituals of fame, desire, and domination. A quiet warning carved not in stone, but in the fragile memory of a boy who once wore a dead woman's crown and paid for it with everything he was.